The black swan theory is a metaphor that describes an unexpected or very rare event. It could be said that it is an event that no one has considered before or anticipated. The black swan theory is based on an ancient claiming that black swans did not exist. This is because most swan spotter are white. However, it came as a surprise when a rare black swan was discovered in Western Australia. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, in his book Fooled by Randomness, he describes the event as an outlier due to the idea that nothing in the past can convince anyone to believe this is a possibility. This is what brings the problem with induction. When we look at past events that make us assume they will happen in the future, this is what Taleb explains in his book on traders who have continuously taken bigger risks than him to make more money and succeeded. This, of course, lasts only until their pattern is completely crashed when they assume their future would match the past. Taleb provides an example of a man named Nero and his neighbor John. While Nero stuck to his rule of avoiding big risk that could cost him vastly, John had no fear in doing so. And because of this, John was able to become very wealthy and never had a doubt that he would go back. While Nero was envious at some points of John's wealth and his huge house across the street, he found to be grateful to himself for sticking to his methods of avoiding huge risk when John inevitably lost his job and his wealth. Let's discuss a similar concept, which is the narrative fallacy. Taleb states that the narrative fallacy addresses our limited ability to look at sequences of facts without weaving an explanation to them. In other words, we see events as stories bind by facts which help them make more sense. It is a chain of cause and effect. The fallacy here is inconsistency in the outcome of those who live very similar stories. For this, I'll provide an example I am most familiar with, which is soccer, careers. Let's consider a soccer player's background that brought upon their future career of playing soccer. What do you think of him? How do you think he got to that position? You might believe that they have dedicated hundreds of hours into training, their coaches and parents have continuously pushed them and supported them to improve, and maybe they just have a natural gift for the sport. But how many people have the exact same background and yet fail to achieve that dream? Probably many. Narrative lures people into believing that we can link our past through cause and effect. The ludic fallacy describes how people mistake the kind of uncertainty found in games to the kind found in real life. Take casinos, for example. Most owners will worry about risk of cheaters and spend millions on high-tech security in order to see the gamblers' actions in the casino. What they do not consider are risks outside the domain of the casino itself. These include a casino star performer being unable to gamble because they had a tragic accident and losing money, or hypothetically, a kidnapping of an owner's family member and having to pay the ransom, a casino being destroyed by a disgruntled person. Now consider a competitive fighting sport. There are rules of where competitors are unable to hit, and thus trainers teach the athletes to focus on the game and ignore the possibility of being kicked in the groin. This is the ludic fallacy, as it does not apply in a real life situation where someone will hesitate to aim for illegal places in a competition. Let's now discuss the concept of survivorship bias. Survivorship bias is defined as the logical error of concentrating on the people or things that made it past some selection process and overlooking those that did not. Taleb uses an example of a woman named Jeanette, a paralegal, and her husband Mark, who is what one would consider a successful lawyer in New York City. Mark lives in an apartment on Park Avenue with Jeanette and their 3 children and makes $500,000 a year. He and his wife have a country house and a rose garden. Jeanette's acquaintances became the parents of her children's private school and their neighbors at the apartment building. Compared to Mark's comrades at college and law school, he did financially way better than the majority. However, compared to his neighbors, in the materialistic standpoint, he is at the bottom. This is because he surrounded himself and his family amongst people who have been far more successful, which caused his wife emotional distress. Geographically, they live in an area that excludes failures, and so being at the bottom of the sample, Jeanette sees her husband as a failure. She wonders, why isn't her husband as successful as others? Why isn't he as successful as he should be being a Harvard grad? This is the example of survivorship bias because she's overlooking those who went through the same process as Mark and were unable to reach his position. Instead, she concentrates on the people they are surrounded by, which makes them financially the least successful in their point of view. Survivorship bias is applied to the tendency of viewing the performance of existing stocks or funds in the market as a representative, comprehensive sample without regarding those that have busted. Taleb claims that we are demonstrably arrogant about what we think we know. People have a built-in tendency to think that we know more than we actually do. Sometimes this can be a serious issue when it involves prediction if we almost always miss the big events. Taleb refers to a study in which participants were asked to make estimations in which they believed to have a 98% chance of being correct and 2% of being incorrect. In other words, they had to be confident in their estimation, such as one that a participant provides. Let's say he makes the claim that I am 98% confident that the population of the United States is between 350 to 400 million people. Taleb found that the results indicated that the 2% error was actually a high 45% in the population being tested. These participants consisted of Harvard Business School students who were quite confident in their own knowledge. Now, Locke's definition of a madman is described in his book, The Black Swan, which is someone who makes rigorous reasoning from faulty premises. This is often used in the field of economics. Various Nobel Prizes have been given to very smart people who are described by this definition. However, many follow these teachings, and as a result, most people think risk equals a worse outcome. As Taleb states, you have to cheat or question your assumptions somewhere to make the world fit perfect mathematics. That is the risk. This can only be applied for certain subjects, which can confuse some people. For example, some attempt to shift their focus away from reality. Consider the military or security as a simple example. As Taleb mentions, they don't care about perfect logical reasoning and instead focus on realistic assumptions, ecological assumptions. They care about saving lives but have to consider only realistic outcomes during the threatening event. Taleb describes the bell curve as the great intellectual fraud and should not be used in social science. The bell curve depicts the normal distributions used commonly in statistics, including analyzing economic and financial data. To support this argument, Taleb disproves the distribution of wealth with the following example. Suppose a sample of 1,000 poor people are given and their average wealth is calculated. We can probably assume that the distribution of wealth is pretty even in the sample. Now let's say Bill Gates was added to the sample and the average was calculated again. This would make the average ridiculously off, and now Bill Gates would be identified as an outlier. What Taleb is trying to prove is that unlike Gaussian distributions, wealth distributions are extremely sensitive to outliers. He believes he is among those who are aware that wealth distribution cannot be fit into a bell curve. Taleb presents two concepts in which random events can be identified. The first is the mediocrism, meaning that province dominated by the mediocre with few extreme successes or failures. In a simpler meaning, no single observation can meaningfully affect the aggregate, or a sample as a whole. According to Taleb, the bell curve is grounded by this concept. Let's consider the following example in his book. 1,000 people are randomly selected and rounded up. Now add the heaviest person you can think of to the sample. Assume that he weighs 3 times the average. He would hardly represent more than a small percentage of the weight of the entire population. Now, let's discuss the extremistan concept, which the province is impacted by a single observation, unlike the mediocristan. So a single observation can meaningfully affect the sample as a whole. Let's bring back Bill Gates for this example. Consider again having 1,000 people lined up and adding up their net worth. Taleb assumes that Bill Gates' net worth is close to $80 billion, with the rest being a few million in total. This makes Bill Gates represent about 99.9% of the total wealth. In contrast to mediocristan, the magnitude of an outlier in extremistan is on an entirely different scale. These two categories can only be measured by certain events or factors. Therefore, analysts are trained for mediocristan events rather than extremistan. It wouldn't make sense to compare, for example, the number of deaths of people drowning in their bathtubs doubling in a year, as Taleb mentions in his book, and compare that to the number of people that died doubling of COVID in a year as well. It just doesn't make sense to compare those two because one of them has a completely different scale than the other one. So these are all the important topics that Taleb talks about in his book, Fooled by Randomness and Black Swan. Thank you.